Good morning, Skallywags. Spoo here with something a little different. Every year, there are roughly 50,000 scripts that are registered with the Writers Guild of America. Of these, only about 150 actually make it to the screen. The rest either sit on a shelf until they're dusted off later on down the road, or until they themselves sit and rot, becoming dust themselves. Many of these scripts are their own original story, while others are early drafts or alternate versions of movies that we actually do get to see. In this series, we're going to take a look at some of those early concepts and try to imagine what may have been the best movies never made. In this first installment, we're going to be taking a look at Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors. Yes, you heard that correct, Wes Craven. You see, when Wes Craven made A Nightmare on Elm Street, he intended for it to actually be a standalone film. But of course, we all know that Freddy Krueger is just too damn entertaining to be a one-and-done kind of guy. So, as part of the deal with New Line Cinema, producer Bob Shaye insisted that Wes Craven go back and write a new ending to the film that would leave the door open for potential sequels. And of course, the film did very well in the box office, so a sequel was rushed into production. However, this time, in order to save a little money, a man named David Chaskin was hired to pen the script. Wes Craven was given the opportunity to come back and direct the sequel, but he absolutely hated the script. So Wes Craven and New Line Cinema would officially part ways. For now. Even though Nightmare on Elm Street 2 did pretty well in the box office, it was pretty much universally panned by critics. But of course, the box office is God in Hollywood, so a third installment was again quickly rushed into development. This time, there were several people actually wanting to throw their respective writing credentials into the ring. Both John Saxon and even Robert Englund himself both pitched ideas. Who knows, maybe we'll take a look at those concepts a little further down the road. But after the failure that was A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, New Line Cinema wanted to go back to what worked. So once again, New Line approached Wes Craven, giving him the opportunity to both write and direct A Nightmare on Elm Street 3. This time he accepted, as long as he could do things his way. New Line agreed. This time, Craven wanted to take things in a totally new direction. Co-writing with Bruce Wagner, Craven set off to write a script that would definitively end the series. And as we all know, much to Wes Craven's disappointment, that wasn't happening. His first pitch to New Line was actually a very meta idea. It involved Freddy invading the real world, attacking a group of people that were actually making a new Nightmare on Elm Street movie. This, of course, might sound a little familiar because it would later go on to become Wes Craven's New Nightmare. At the time, New Line Cinema not on board with this idea, so of course it was shelved and later would come off the shelf. But for the time being, Wes Craven went back to the writing room. He and Wagner knew that whatever direction the movie ended up going, it had to be something bigger. Not just one person fighting against Freddy, but an entire group of people. He knew that the souls of the people that Freddy had killed over the years had definitely made him stronger, so it would take something equally as strong to take him down. And thus, the Dream Warriors were born. By the time the movie finally hit screens, Chuck Russell had the director's credit, and the writing credits would go to Wes Craven, Bruce Wagner, Chuck Russell himself, and even Frank Darabont. Frank Darabont, of course, being the man that did season 1 of The Walking Dead. He wrote and directed The Shawshank Redemption, The Green Mile. The reason Chuck and Frank were listed as writers as well is because Wes and Bruce's idea of a script was way too dark to actually go before general audiences. So Chuck and Frank Darabont were brought in to do another pass on the script, kind of lighten things up a little bit. In Wes Craven's version, not only was it just way darker, Freddy didn't have his little comedic one-liners. He still had a little bit of humor, but it was more the sadistic humor that he had in part 1. Many of the deaths in the scripts were actually set up to look like suicides. And there is one scene in the film that is quite possibly my favorite Freddy kill ever, and it sucks because it never actually made it to screen and I hate it. But we'll get there. So what was that script that was labeled First Draft, June 16th, 1986? Like? Well, let's take a look, shall we? The very first shot of the movie, we pan down to a woman's pregnant belly. Almost immediately, a tiny clawed hand burst its way through the belly, slashing the woman open. And infant Freddy emerges. Shades of The Dream Child, anyone? The infant Freddy glares down at the screen as the camera shoots back and reveals a ranch-style house. Now, we're going to see this house pop up quite a bit, so I'm just going to refer to it as the ranch house. The camera keeps shooting back from the ranch house all the way out into space until finally it comes back down and reveals our opening titles. This turns into a montage as we go through several large cities all across the United States, seeing missing posters and milk cartons of missing children. Finally, at the end of this montage, we focus in on one last missing poster, the picture on which is simply described as a pretty redhead girl that we'll see shortly. We then cut away to find Nancy Thompson. Just like in Nightmare 3, she's back, and she's driving a car down a dark country road. She's listening to the radio, and somebody on the radio says that the suicide rate amongst teens aged 15 to 19 has grown 136% between 1960 and 1980. About this time, on the side of the road, she sees a hitchhiker, and she actually pulls over to help the girl out. It is, of course, the redheaded girl that we just saw in the missing poster. She looks very disheveled, she's barefoot, she's shaking, and looks absolutely terrified. Nancy picks her up, she gets in the car, they start driving. Nancy tries to strike up a conversation, but the girl is just sitting there kind of rocking back and forth. Finally, Nancy pops the question of, well, where are you headed? Her response is simply, down, down, down where he you. Right as she says that, a tire blows and the car goes careening off the road into a field. Nancy mentions that she doesn't have a spare, so she's going to have to go and find help. The girl simply rolls her window up and starts rocking back and forth, singing to herself. You know, completely normal stuff. Nancy begins walking until she comes across the ranch house from earlier, and right there, smack dab in the middle of the front yard, are a couple of girls playing jump rope and singing, 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. You know the rest. They look up and see Nancy and just scatter off into the woods. And Nancy actually heads up to the front door of the house because apparently she hasn't learned a thing in her life. She walks inside and says hello, but instead of anyone answering, she just hears kind of a whirring sound coming from the end of this long hallway in front of her. She heads down the hall, and at the end she finds an elevator. She pushes the button, and a big down sign comes on. The doors immediately open. Nancy steps inside, and she sees that the numbers start at 1, and they go down until they hit like 25, and then they start jumping up to like 50, 100, 150, 500, 1,000, so on and so forth. You get the idea. She tries to step back out, but the doors just slam shut right in front of her, and the thing starts dropping, like just plummeting down into the ground, presumably. The script says that the elevator is not just going down, but also goes side to side and up and down, and kind of like a roller coaster. Suddenly, the floor actually starts to open up, and heat and wind start pouring their way through as if the elevator is falling into hell itself. Suddenly, a claw reaches in and starts feeling its way around, looking for Nancy. Nancy stomps on the claw, and the claw pulls back. The elevator stops. The doors open, and ahead of her she finds yet another very long hallway. And she sees at the end of this hall, or somewhere down this hall, the shape of someone walking towards her. It's her dad. He looks just like we remember him from part 1, a little gray perhaps, but he's still wearing his uniform and looks like, a day hasn't passed other than that. Nancy runs up and hugs him and asks why he left her, and he explains that he's been chasing Freddy down for the last 5 years. And finally, he's tracked him to this house, the house where Freddy was born. He mentions that he burned Freddy again, and he kind of gestures over. There's a pair of handcuffs that has a charred arm still hanging from it. The rest of the body is nowhere to be seen, which the dad simply explains, wonder where the rest of him got off to. Because, of course, that's a perfectly normal response. And eventually the arm actually falls out of the handcuffs and starts scurrying away like Thing. Meanwhile, back at the car, the girl is still sitting there. She's trying to calm herself down when we see something coming up behind the car. It's Freddy's arm. It goes over the car, comes back through the windshield and into her mouth, ripping her out through the windshield, and drags her away up a tree. Her legs leaving a little trail from the car over to the tree that it takes her up to the top of. Meanwhile, Nancy and John are still trying to chase the other arm that's trying to scurry away from them, and it finally reaches a little tiny window that they're they can't follow through, and it crawls up and it goes through the window. John tells Nancy, don't close your eyes or he'll get away, and promptly pulls out a knife and slices his eyelids off, and we quickly cut away. So Nancy is back in the car. She wakes up suddenly, and we're introduced to Neil, which is the doctor from part 3. He's kind of looking in the window, and he's asking, Miss, are you okay? Are you okay? Nancy says that the last thing she remembers was looking for a hotel and falling asleep at the wheel. She has no idea if the hitchhiker was real or just simply part of her dream. Neil says that you're never going to make it to a hotel because your axle is broken, but you can leave the car here and we can have it towed in the morning. You can just come stay with me in my guest room. Never accept to stay in someone's guest room that you literally just met 3 seconds ago when waking up from a nightmare. That never ends up okay. Let this be a life lesson to you, okay? Anyway, Nancy agrees to the invitation for whatever and says that she smells something weird. Neil says that she must have hit something because there's blood all over the inside of the car and the outside of the car and everywhere. But, you look okay, so you must have hit a deer or something. Nancy goes back to Neil's house. We kind of skip over the next day or two. The only real thing that kind of comes out of this scene is Nancy explaining that she's been looking for her dad for the last 5 years. And Neil finds out that she's the one that's taking Hypnosil, which, if you remember in part 3, is the drug that makes you stop dreaming. But then we finally come to the second night. Oh, the second night. Nancy's lying in bed. There's a gentle breeze blowing in through the open window. And suddenly, the hitchhiker from earlier, she comes floating through that window. Her arms are like up, covering her head. She floats over until she's levitating just above Nancy, and Nancy wakes up. The hitchhiker explains that Freddy ripped her beautiful hair off, and she moves her arm, and her entire scalp and hair fall right there onto Nancy's chest. It then starts to crawl up and wraps around Nancy's throat and starts to strangle her. Meanwhile, the hitchhiker floats down until their noses are practically touching. She's just taunting Nancy the whole time. And suddenly, Neil bursts into the room, and all he can see is just Nancy struggling with something that's not there. She screams for him to help, and he runs over, slaps the crap out of her, then climbs on top of her and starts shimmying himself down to her feet, where his mouth opens wide and he starts eating Nancy. This is, of course, the snake scene from Nightmare on Elm Street 3, except it's Nancy, it's not Kirsten, and it's Neil, not Freddy, although he does eventually become Freddy. Right as he gets up to her chin, he stops for a second and says, "Give Freddy a little head." And Nancy starts clawing at the face when suddenly the real Neil runs into the room again. He runs over and starts shaking Nancy violently, trying to get her to wake up. And finally she does, and she's safe. He asks her about the Hypnosil. She says it's not working anymore. And she collapses into Neil's arms. And that's when Neil notices that there's pieces of flesh hanging from Nancy's fingernails. The next morning there's a really quick scene where Neil takes Nancy back to her car, but the car's gone. They start talking about the Hypnosil, and Nancy says that she has not had a dream in the last 5 years. There's a nice little drop of the "Every Town Has an Elm Street" line, a little pre-Freddy's Dead sort of thing, but Nancy says it actually. And they notice that tree that the hitchhiker got dragged up smells like rotten eggs, and there's just a giant murder of crows at the top of it picking away at something. The next scene is kind of in the movie. It's basically the introduction scene to Kirsten, except in this script she's called Kirsten, not Kristen, so that won't be confusing at all. Basically, Neil and Nancy arrive at the hospital, and one of the orderlies runs out and says that they've got another suicide attempt. It's a Jane Doe. They run inside, and they find Kirsten. She's being held down by Max, which is the Lawrence Fishburne character from Part 3. She's fighting against them, him and a couple of other orderlies. Finally, she gets away and manages to grab a pair of scissors, which, why there are scissors in this room, that's beside the point. But she kind of runs over to the corner and starts, huddling up in a little ball. Neil actually says that he knows her, and that's where we get that her name is Kirsten. She sees Nancy and she starts singing, "1, 2, Freddy's coming for you." You know how it goes. But she gets to 9, 10 and she stops. Nancy finishes it, kind of just like in the movie. Nancy asks her, where did you learn that rhyme? But Kirsten doesn't answer her. And we move on to where Nancy gets to meet the rest of the group. He kind of takes her down the hallway and introduces them to her like a room at a time, basically, instead of just meeting them all at once in group. Most of the kids are actually pretty similar to how they are in the movie. A couple of little differences here and there. Jennifer is pretty much exactly the same, cigarette burns and all. Next, we meet Taryn, who is not like the punk rock girl that she is in the movie. Instead, she is described as a 15-year-old black girl who is obsessed with fire. She actually has the line of, speaking of fire, that sometimes you need it, sometimes you just have to burn something all the way down. Up next, we meet Kincaid, who's busy fighting with a couple of orderlies. In the script, I don't know if they meant for him to kind of be similar to what he is in the movie. They only describe him as being 17, 250 pounds, bald, and mean as hell. They say that he just had a hallucination and snapped one day. They try to strap him to a chair, but the straps just instantly break, and he's still fighting with the orderlies, but the second that Nancy walks in the door, he goes completely calm. Nancy asks him what made him flip out, and he just says that it was the man with the hat. Neil and Nancy go outside, and he starts explaining that the kids kind of come here from all over the place. The only one of them that is actually local is Kirsten. The rest of them all showed up here, attempted suicide, and ended up in the hospital. And nobody seems to know why. In fact, suicide and sleep disorders are the only things that connect them all together. Otherwise, everything about them is completely different. Nancy suggests that it's nightmares, but Neil shoots that down, saying that they have them all on EEG. I don't know what that is, but apparently it stops REM sleep, so they don't dream. Suddenly, this guy comes out and says that Nancy's car has been found on top of a grain silo, so they go out to check it out. It's all trash, there's slash marks all over it. They've got like a crane pulled out to get the car off the top of the thing. Everybody's, sitting around, how did they get up there? What's going on? Nothing much else happens in that scene. And then she, that being Nancy, and Neil head over to Kirsten's parents' house. The mom is pretty much exactly the same as she is in the movie, but here we actually get to meet her dad as well. Basically, they are your stereotypical rich, tennis-playing 80s yuppie type people. Nancy asks her if Kirsten's been acting differently lately. She says she's always looking for attention, but she's not going to get it from me. Nancy asks about nightmares, and her mom just says, well, ever since I took away her credit cards, of course she's having nightmares. She says that they're actually planning on sending Kirsten to a strict Catholic reform school for girls as soon as she is out of the hospital. Nancy asks if she can see Kirsten's room, saying that she wants to grab her a change of clothes and some socks, that type of thing. She's snooping around and she finds, one of those little photo booth picture strips. It's got like the 4 pictures on it. And it's got Kirsten and actually the redheaded girl from earlier. Kind of fast forward, they're back in the car. Neil's trying to make small talk and Nancy's just sort of drifting off. Suddenly, Neil stops, and when Nancy looks up, they're right in front of the ranch house. Nancy says that, I don't want to stop here, but Neil points out, well, we have to. We're stuck in a roadblock. The cop that's up ahead that's kind of directing traffic, he looks over, he sees Neil, recognizes him, he comes over to talk. Nancy, meanwhile, is busy staring down the ranch house, and she thinks that she sees a shadow moving in one of the windows. So she gets out of the car and starts walking towards it, because apparently she hasn't learned her lesson over the years. The cop actually leads Neil over to a gurney where we find the body of the redheaded girl. There's practically nothing left. All the crows had pecked away at it, but they found her up at the top of a tree, and it appears to be suicide, because suicide by crows eating you is a thing in this world, apparently. Nancy enters the house, and everything looks completely normal. She goes back to where the elevator was. There's nothing there but just like a cabinet or a cupboard or whatever, closet. She opens like a bedroom door, and there's like a completely normal looking room inside with like a table and some chairs and whatnot. She goes to step in, and suddenly she's in water. Like, she goes right through the floor and she's in water. She looks up above her. She can still see the chair and the table and everything is there, just kind of suspended on top of the water, but she's being pulled down. At the bottom, she actually sees her dad just kind of hanging out down there. His eyes are still bleeding from where he cut his eyelids off earlier. She manages to swim back up, and she pulls herself out of the water back into the hallway, and she hears a baby crying upstairs. So of course, she has to go investigate that now. The upstairs is like really slanted. It's like Uncle Tom's Cabin or whatever it's called at Silver Dollar City. That type of thing. Funhouse type of deal. Slanted, and it's actually shrinking as it goes further down the hall. And at the end of the hall, she reaches this teeny tiny little door. She opens it up, and inside, there's little baby Freddy, like dirty pants, sweater, fedora, the whole 9 yards. Which, let's face it, that would just be adorable. It looks at Nancy and just goes, "Mama!" and like starts trudging towards her with the claws out. As it gets closer to her, it actually grows into the adult Freddy, which I totally disagree with. I would love just little tiny toddler Freddy running around. That would just be awesome. Nancy jumps back and she falls down the stairs. Freddy like leaps and lands right on top of her, but she manages to slide out right at the last second and gets out the front door. Well, Freddy chases her as far as the front door. And so, you know, you think of Freddy and you think of some of the more classic lines that Freddy has had over the years, you know, welcome to prime time, bitch, and all of that type of stuff. Take that and contrast with a line like this one. I'll get you, asleep or awake, I'll shit on your corpse. Kind of makes you wonder what Wes Craven's home life is like, you know, back in the day. She starts running back towards Neil, screaming and flailing around. You know, he's alive, he's real, it wasn't a nightmare. Neil has no idea what she's talking about. The house is kind of like obstructed by some trees and stuff, but the cop does mention that the old Kruger house is back in that direction. So Nancy and Neil, they go back to the house to investigate, but of course everything is completely normal now. Neil says that he was actually at this house just a couple of weeks ago because there was a man who had barricaded himself inside and set the house on fire. Said that the guy was like ranting and raving that the house was alive, and they've got the guy at the hospital now. So of course Nancy says, I need to see this man immediately. So they head back off to the hospital. There's actually a really neat little entry in the script here where it says that as they leave, the window of the house kind of takes the shape of Freddy, and it actually describes the where Freddy comes out of the wall in part 1. It says that it's very similar to that. It goes on to kind of say that whatever imagery is used here, it is supposed to imply that Freddy is part of the house, that he is the house. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Neil and Nancy arrive. There's a man in a padded cell. They said that he blinded himself during the entire ranch house debacle. And of course, it's John. It's Nancy's dad. He suddenly becomes very serious, and he asks Nancy, do you know what's happening? He says that he's always wanted to protect her, even from parts of reality. But that he knew somehow after that night on Elm Street that he had just been protecting himself. He says that after that night, he knew he had to do something. He had to track Freddy down. He had to confront him when he, in the place where he's most vulnerable, in the house where he was born. He says that Freddy is becoming more powerful with every person that he kills, and the only way to kill the evil is to burn it in the place where it was born. Nancy says that, burning down a house isn't going to do anything. Freddy's dead. He only exists in dreams. And John kind of confirms that Freddy is the house, and that the house is actually the entrance to his nightmare, to Freddy's nightmare. He says you must burn down the house while it can still be burned, or else live in a world that is whatever Freddy makes it. We get a really quick scene where Nancy's room is too cold, so Neil tries to convince her to sleep with him. And then we're just right back to the asylum again, where we meet a few more patients. Some of these scenes just kind of seem like filler, but what can you do? Now we meet Joey. He's described as being very frail and spasmodic. In this script, he is actually the one that built the papier-mâché Freddy's house, and says that the detail is just absolutely perfect, all the way down to this little wind chime thing that's on the front porch. Actually, earlier in the movie, Nancy saw that little mobile, or whatever you want to call it, wind chime, and it was Freddy's, claws kind of hanging there, which I thought that was kind of neat. We also meet Joey's roommate, who is a guy named Laredo, who is described as long hair, 19, and very good looking. In the script, he's the one that builds the clay figures. It says that he's got about 50 of them, and he's very, very into fantasy. D&D, wizards, that type of stuff. Basically, he is a combination of Philip and Will from A Nightmare on Elm Street 3. But speaking of Philip, Philip is also there. He's described as being the youngest out of the group. And much like he was in A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, he is also a sleepwalker. Max is kind of making the rounds and he tells everybody to go to bed, but Laredo asks if he can go to the arts and crafts room to get his clay before lights out. Fast forward a little bit and Max is watching some TV in the nurse's station when suddenly Philip shows up sleepwalking behind him. Max doesn't notice. Up close, Philip is described as being a terrified child who is too afraid to cry. In this, instead of the marionette type stuff, we just get Freddy kind of standing behind him, moving his arms back and forth and moving his legs back and forth. Basically, he's like a walking puppet with Freddy stuck to his back. And we kind of cut back and forth, so we see, Freddy walking with him in some shots and Philip walking alone in some shots, and then we actually see him kind of fade in and out, described as like a TV station that won't come in fully. Philip tries to scream out to Max, but he's just completely paralyzed. Freddy won't let him scream. There's a really sick and twisted Freddy moment when Philip actually asks Freddy, "Why me? Why me?" And it says that Freddy just smiles and says, "Because I like you," as drool runs down his chin and on to Philip's shoulder. Kind of like Will in the movie, Laredo sees Philip out, heading outside, sleepwalking, and he sees Freddy fading in and out as well, so he runs to get help. He runs into Kincaid's room and shows him what's happening, so they start banging on the window, trying to get Philip to wake up, but it's not working. Freddy walks Philip up to a street curb, and we hear a siren coming from somewhere off screen. And something very weird here, but there's like a single page missing from the script. I don't know why, but yeah, it's just one page that's just blank. But long story short, Freddy forces Philip to step in front of a speeding ambulance, and of course, that's the end of Philip, and of course, it makes it look like a suicide. Next day, they're all in a group therapy session. All the kids are there, as well as Neil and Dr. Madalena, who's kind of the mean doctor from Nightmare 3. Neil and Dr. Madalena are basically, saying Philip just committed suicide. It was just a suicide. And Laredo and Kincaid, they're arguing back. "You didn't see what we saw." Nancy, who is also there for reasons, she's like, "Tell them what you saw," but they just basically say, "We can't, it'll make us look like we're crazy. They're not going to believe us." Meanwhile, Kirsten says that she wants to go home. Dr. Madalena says that she's scheduled to leave tomorrow, but Nancy says, "You should stay. You're safer here. You're amongst people that can help you." To which finally Madalena asks the obvious question of, "Who are you? And why are you here?" She demands that Neil kick Nancy out, which, let's be fair here. You don't work here. You're just some random lady. Get out. Out in the hallway, Neil says that Nancy should probably get somebody that she can talk to, which of course pisses Nancy off. Nancy says that neither she nor those kids are crazy, and that she had actually seen Kirsten's friend, whose name is Becky, by the way, just the night before when she had met Neil. Neil tries to blow it off as PTSD, says she should just get some sleep. It'll be fine. Sleep off that PTSD, because that's how that works. We get a really quick scene with Kirsten in the EEG lab. Neil steps out of the room, leaving Nancy there alone, and Kirsten's level starts spiking like crazy. Kirsten even disappears for a minute, and Nancy starts screaming for Neil to come back. He finally does, and of course he doesn't believe what Nancy tells him, but he does look at the charts, and he's like, something's wrong with the machine. It's impossible to get levels this high. We cut from that to Kirsten's parents picking her up for some reason, which seems like an odd cut, but okay. And Kirsten tells Nancy, "I'll see you in my dreams." Which, of course, is a little bit of foreshadowing, because, yes, she does have that power in this version as well. From there, we get Jennifer's death scene, which is pretty much exactly like it is in the movie, except instead of Freddy's head coming out of the top of the TV, he just kind of appears on screen. And instead of, "Welcome to prime time, bitch," that he says in the movie, which that line was improvised by Robert Englund, in case you didn't know. A little fun trivia fact there for you. Instead, he kind of goes all game show host, and he's like, oh, we've got a great show for you tonight, Jennifer. Lights out. And then smashes her head into it. And again, it is called a suicide, because someone leaping into the air and smashing their head into a TV that is hanging near the ceiling is a way that people can commit suicide in this world. Creative. The next scene is just kind of weird. Kirsten is actually back in school. It's a day or two later. She's still got bandages on her wrist from where she tried to kill herself. And she gets made fun of by this couple named Brad and Sally. They, I guess, are all in the same psych class together, and the teacher is talking about how humans spend roughly 4.5 years of their life dreaming. The teacher then asks Brad to come up and read a passage from the book, so he does, and it's kind of like the scene from part 1, except this time it's Kirsten and Sally both start to kind of nod off. In the dream, Kirsten is still in class, but it's like filled with fog. She walks over to Sally's desk, and Sally's sitting there, filing her nails in the typical 80s bad girl way. And the weird part is Kirsten reaches over and rips Sally's top off, which causes them both to wake up. So Sally starts screaming because now here she is topless in class, and Kirsten is just kind of sitting back all proud of herself. But I guess it's an 80s horror movie. You gotta work the topless scene in there somewhere. So, might as well be here, I guess. Right? Cut to later that night. Nancy goes back to the ranch house again. This time she's carrying a can of gas with her. But suddenly this cop car pulls up, and she runs and jumps into the bushes. A cop gets out and he's taking a leak in front of the house. So Nancy gets scared off. She runs back to the hospital. She goes back to see her dad. Her dad's like, you didn't do it. You didn't burn the house down. And she's like, well, how'd you know? And he says, because to do so, you're going to need a dream warrior. He said the name of the movie, guys! Hey! Meanwhile, over at Kirsten's house, she's laying down to go to bed. She's been looking over brochures for the girls' school that her parents are planning on sending her to. She lays down, turns the light off, and suddenly her body snaps into a crucifix position. Stigmata appears on her hands and feet. She begins to levitate and floats out the window and suddenly finds herself at the girls' school. She floats into a classroom that's filled with girls that are all wearing red and green plaid outfits. She floats into the cloakroom where the cloaks are all red and green. They pin her to the floor. She manages to squirm her way out of that and runs out at the door from the cloakroom and finds herself in the ranch house right in front of the elevator. Freddy shows up behind her and asks if she's crossed herself today, and slices the crucifix into his chest, and we get that green pus stuff that we got from the first movie kind of spilling out of him. So a nice little callback there. Kirsten starts screaming for Nancy to help. Well, meanwhile, Nancy is back at Neil's house. She's sitting in bed rather. She's writing in her diary. Suddenly the pen flies out of her hand, then the diary flies out of her hand, and then Nancy actually gets pulled into the bed. Back at the ranch house, Freddy's closing in on Kirsten. He's got her backed into a corner and he lunges at her. He's about to stab her or slice her up or whatever. Suddenly Nancy comes falling from the ceiling, landing right on top of Freddy, knocking him to the ground. Without skipping a beat, Kirsten grabs Nancy. They take off running, leaving Freddy behind. He gets up. He starts chasing them down this seemingly endless, long hallway. While they're running, Nancy's like, how am I here? How did you do that? And Kirsten's like, I just wished for you to be here. So Nancy's like, well, wish for us to be out of here then. And right as they reach a wall at the end of the hallway, they disappear. Freddy slams into the wall. And Nancy and Kirsten appear back in Kirsten's room. And Nancy's like, we need to talk. So they go off to a coffee shop to have a nice little conversation about little powers and stuff that apparently you've got. So they're sitting there at the coffee shop, and Nancy's like, have you ever done this before? Kirsten explains that she used to do it when she was a kid. Hasn't done it since then, but when she was a kid, she would have bad dreams. She would wish for her brother to be there, and he would always come in and help her, but he never remembered it the next day. Nancy asks if Kirsten has ever dreamt of Freddy before. She says that she feels like she has, but she's not entirely sure, because anytime she starts trying to think about it, she gets fogged out. Nancy asks if she feels like, can you pull him out of the dream? Kirsten says she's just simply too scared to even think about trying that one, but Nancy says, you may not have a choice here, but if you can pull him out, I'll face him. So we cut back to Neil's house. Kirsten and Nancy are there. It's like the next day, and they're about to try out their little plan. And one nice little screw up here that I simply could not ignore. Kirsten's like, we should go in together. We'll be safer that way. And Nancy's like, no, I got to do this on my own. Even though she had just said Kirsten should go in to pull him out, and then she would, but whatever. Okay, Nancy's going in alone. So she falls asleep. She's back at the ranch house. She goes back to the bushes and gets her gas can out from where she had left it earlier when she got spooked by the cop. And then Kirsten drops in and she's like, thought you could use some help. Didn't you literally just say we should do this together? And Nancy's like, no, I got this. I'm going alone. So first it was Nancy telling Kirsten, you got to do this. Then it was Nancy saying, no, I got to do this alone. And now you're here anyway. I got nothing. Anyway, this German Shepherd comes running out of nowhere. It's got red and green fur. It's got Freddy's face, so that would have been some cool imagery. So they immediately drop the gas can again, and they run into the house. Why? There's other directions, people. You can go anywhere. Inside, they run down the hall and they go into this room, and Jennifer jumps out at them and her face is being eaten by maggots. They turn to escape, but Freddy's there waiting for them, and he slashes and he cuts deep into Kirsten's arm. Nancy tries to pull her away, and Kirsten gets scared and she screams, I don't want to die, and she calls out for Kincaid, who is in his room just sitting there with Joey, and all of a sudden he gets sucked into a chair, so Joey starts freaking out. Kincaid crashes in. Immediately Freddy goes after him, but Kincaid just punches Freddy and Freddy goes flying. I would absolutely have loved to have seen this sequence, because it says that when Freddy gets back up, he is twice as big, twice as tall, his claws twice as long. So just Monster Freddy coming after Kincaid would have just been awesome. And I'm going to pause here for a second, because I basically want to say, and I know this is weird timing for this, but I just want to say how much I love that this is, it's basically a Nightmare on Elm Street 3, but with the tone of a Nightmare on Elm Street 1. It's like if you can imagine where the original Nightmare on Elm Street franchise would have gone if Wes Craven had been in charge of the entire franchise, what direction would it have taken? This darker, more violent, more scary direction. And it's amazing, because you can still see, the bits and pieces of Part 3 in there. They're just a little different than they were in the movie we actually got to see. And why am I throwing it in now instead of saying this at the beginning or the end? Well, because one, this is where our dream team kind of come together. You've got Kirsten, you've got Nancy, and you're starting to bring the other kids in as well. I always loved Kincaid. He was always one of my favorite characters from a Nightmare movie. So it's nice to see him even, more badass than he was in the actual movie itself. The other reason I bring this up now is because this is where we're going to take a pause. If I was to make this into one long video, it would be one ridiculously long video, and it's already a long video. So we're about halfway through. We're kind of where things start picking up now, so I figure it's a good time to stop. So if you want to see how this thing wraps up, join me next week, next Wednesday to be exact, and we will finish this thing up. And yeah, you don't want to miss it, because it gets insane, including, like I said before, probably my absolute favorite Freddy kill ever, and it never even made it to screen, and that's unfortunate. So yes, thank you guys for joining me. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Make sure you comment, like, share, subscribe. Got a movie that you would love to hear a review or an overview of the unmade version of the script for, let me know. I would be glad to do that. I've got a few in the works already. So thank you guys so much for watching. Join me next Wednesday for the conclusion of Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors. Thanks for watching.